Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the rigorous mechanics behind a piece of storytelling technology you've probably known since you were a little kid. Yep, we're talking about fables. Now, you might just think of them as simple, cozy bedtime stories, but actually, they are highly engineered rhetorical devices with this incredibly rich global history.
Let's just dive right into this with a pretty provocative question. Why exactly are talking animals the perfect Trojan horse to completely bypass our human defensiveness and, deliver these heavy moral payloads? Have you ever actually wondered why we don't just tell each other the lesson directly? Like, why dress it all up in the feathers of a crow or the fur of a fox?
Well, to answer that, this explainer is going to systematically break down our topic into 4 clear parts. First, the anatomy of a fable. Second, fables through the ages. Third, the 7 fable types. And finally, classical versus modern fables.
All right, starting with Section 1, Anatomy of a Fable, Building the Trojan Horse. Let's see exactly how this literary device is constructed.
So, fundamentally, a fable is just a brief, didactic story engineered to deliver a very specific ethical or practical lesson. The fancy academic term for that explicit moral tacked onto the very end? That's the epimetheium. And if we look at the roots here, the Latin word fabula literally just meant a spoken narrative, which is related to the Greek mythos. But over time, that term narrowed down strictly to this very specific format: short, moral-driven tales featuring anthropomorphized protagonists.
The whole architecture relies on 4 distinct characteristics. First up, we've got symbolism and anthropomorphization. That's just giving animals human traits, so they function as both literal characters and universal symbols. Then, there's the undeniable didactic purpose. The story exists entirely to teach us something. Third is brevity. That's the classical ideal of saying the absolute most in the fewest words possible, which is what makes them so incredibly memorable. But the true genius? That lies in the 4th characteristic: humor and irony. These act as facilitating mechanisms. They totally lower our defenses. They let us laugh at the foolishness of a vain crow or a greedy dog, right up until the trap snaps shut, and we suddenly recognize that exact same folly in ourselves.
And the brilliance of this design is its teleological plot structure, which really just means everything is constantly moving toward an end goal. First, we establish the traits. Then, we introduce a conflict that tests those traits. Next, we resolve it to validate the outcome and immediately deliver that moral. Every single narrative element is economically designed to push you toward that final resolution. There's literally 0 wasted space.
This structural economy ensures the underlying theme gets translated into a highly transmissible, totally universal maxim. I mean, think of the classic phrase, "slow and steady wins the race." We all instantly recognize this from the tortoise and the hare. Because the setting is so minimal, it's usually just a generic road or a forest, the lesson becomes universally transferable across different cultures and centuries.
Now that we've got the core mechanics down, let's move right into Section 2, Fables through the Ages, Global Deployment.
Tracing this historically, we see that we aren't just talking about ancient Greece here. The earliest surviving fable-like texts actually pop up in ancient Sumerian and Akkadian literature, all the way back in the 3rd millennium BCE. These featured intense cosmological debates between animals. Then, look at India in the 3rd century BCE with the Panchatantra. Attributed to the sage Vishnu Sharma, this was a highly sophisticated collection of animal tales deliberately nested inside one another to teach statecraft and practical wisdom to young princes. From there, the idea spread like wildfire. It moves through the Greek Aesopic tradition, gets elevated to high art in 17th century France by La Fontaine, and makes it all the way to 1945 with George Orwell. It has consistently been an absolutely crucial geopolitical and pedagogical tool.
So the crucial takeaway here is that fables definitely weren't just for kids. They were serious instruments of power and survival. Take the semi-legendary Aesop in the 6th century BCE, for example. Ancient biographical tradition portrays him as an enslaved person from Phrygia or Thrace. For him, deploying these brief symbolic stories wasn't just some fun little literary exercise. No, it was a literal survival tactic. By wrapping his critiques of powerful people in the guise of animals, he could navigate treacherous court politics and those super rigid social hierarchies without, actually losing his head.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 7 fable types, an expansive arsenal. Let's see how the fable evolved into several highly versatile formats as it spread globally. The fable actually adapts beautifully to its environment. We have your standard Aesopic fables, which deal with clear binary moral oppositions.
But then, look at folk fables, like the amazing Anansi spider stories, which rely heavily on oral transmission to reinforce communal wisdom. Then you've got the beast fable, like Reynard the Fox from medieval Europe. That one stretches the form out into sustained episodic political satire. And let's not forget religious fables, like the Buddhist Jataka tales, which use this exact same animal narrative framework to communicate really complex theological doctrines.
Rounding out our 7 types, we have the broader, more general category of animal fables, the highly refined literary fables, where authors like La Fontaine elevated the form to high aesthetic art for a really educated audience, and finally, modern fables. Whether it's a 17th century poem or a modern animated film tackling prejudice, the underlying structural framework we discussed earlier remains remarkably durable. It just works.
However, as we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, the classical mold underwent a fundamental transformation. Let's look at Section 4, Classical versus Modern Fables, the Modern Upgrade.
What's really fascinating here is the stark contrast between the two. For thousands of years, classical fables focused purely on universal themes of private morality. You know the drill. Don't be vain, don't be greedy, make sure you work hard. And the characters were flat. The fox was always just cunning, period. But modern fables completely flip this. We see a massive shift toward complex, morally ambiguous critiques of systemic social structures. The characters suddenly become psychologically complex and often super contradictory. And that explicit, tidy little moral at the end, it's frequently replaced by irony or unresolved tension.
Just look at the themes they tackle now. Today's modern fables operate through cinema, graphic novels, and digital platforms to address massive contemporary issues. We're talking political authoritarianism, the looming environmental crisis, post-colonial identity, and all the weird complexities of our digital culture. The scope has vastly expanded from the individual right to the global stage.
Landmark texts perfectly demonstrate this shift. Think about George Orwell's Animal Farm. Orwell didn't actually invent a new genre. He deliberately redeployed the classical beast fable structure specifically for radical, anti-totalitarian commentary. By mapping the Russian Revolution onto farm animals, he utilized that ancient Trojan horse technique to make a devastating political critique incredibly accessible. Similarly, Kafka's Metamorphosis, which is often read as a modern fable, uses the completely absurd transformation into a bug to explore alienation and systemic apathy.
In fact, our source material highlights 8 distinct dimensions where modern fables deliberately subvert those classical conventions, from replacing transparent allegory with multi-layered ambiguity to shifting away from oral storytelling toward instantaneous multimedia global broadcasting. Modern creators are literally using the bones of Aesop to expose the systemic injustices of our current world. They use our deep, childhood familiarity with the form to challenge our adult assumptions.
As fables continue to evolve beyond print and into interactive media, they will undoubtedly keep using non-human entities to hold a mirror right up to our human flaws, which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to end on. If you were to sit down and write a fable right now about our current era of algorithms, social media, and constant connectivity, what anthropomorphized creature would best symbolize our modern digital culture? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the stories you hear.